Okay, so first we would like to dedicate this talk to our mentor, starting off from our pit, as I said, Ofer Bar Yosef. I like this picture very much because he sits here at Nahal Engev, which you'll hear a lot about, on the bench of Building 3, wearing the shirt of Kabara Cave and the hat of Hayonim Cave. And he started off with us the project at Nahal Engev. He was with us for 3 years with Anna, and then he left the project, but still we continued to discuss a lot of the topics that we're going to talk today. Especially, we had long discussions on continuity and discontinuity. He thought, by the way, that we have this bias in research for continuity, not discontinuity, and he thought that we should push forward to find these lines of separations. So in this talk, we will go back in time, although we are one of the last talks in this series. It's time to go back to the Epipaleolithic, and we're lucky to go into the chronological scheme that we have represented in our area in the southern Levant, going back from the early and middle Epipaleolithic to the early and late Natufian, all the way to the PP and C. And in this talk, we will try to see how we can define the boundaries specifically between the late Natufian and the Ppna, and try to zoom into these cultural entities between the Epipaleolithic and the Neolithic. In this slide, you see the radiocarbon probability distribution of radiocarbon dates that we have from the early Natufian to the late Natufian and Ppna. Unfortunately, the samples are not so big, but we can see the trend. We see that the peak of the early Natufian is exactly at the middle of the time of its entity, and it starts quite abrupt. And then the turnover to the late Natufian is quite clear. And later on, the Ppna has maybe some parallel sequence to the late Natufian. So we have already by radiocarbon dates maybe some sort of contemporaries between these two phases. This scheme was done in 2013, and since then we have many new radiocarbon dates, not many, but some. And I want to point out the most recent that was published by Tobias and colleagues that show that even in areas that are beyond what was the Mediterranean zone or beyond the core area, we have dates that go back to around 15,000 or maybe 14,600. So this is the scheme, and we will try to follow up it. And what we're going to do is try to zoom in and zoom out, zoom into the area where we're studying, the area of the Sea of Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, and specifically we will center, of course, on Nahal Engev. We have, because of this long sequence, we are able to zoom in and zoom out through this long sequence. And after figuring out what's going on in Nahal Engev, which luckily for us sits exactly at the point, at the junction between the Epipaleolithic and the Ppna by date, which you will see shortly, we will zoom out both in spatial and chronological. Before we zoom in all the way to Nahal Engev 2, where we're working now for the past 10 years, I want to introduce the closest area. And this also connects with Ofer because his PhD, part of it, a large part of his PhD was also defining this area of Engev, which sits to the east of the Sea of Galilee. He defined 4 sites and gave 1, 2, 3, and 4. And unfortunately also gave a similar name to 2 sites that were in the Wadi En-Gev, and Nahal En-Gev 1 and Nahal En-Gev 2. Nahal En-Gev 1 is at the end of the Upper Paleolithic, which is not part of the sequence we're going to show now, but En-Gev 1 to 4 sit chronologically in the early parts of the Epipaleolithic and also in the middle part. And indeed, we see only following the microlithic that typify each culture entity, we see that in this close area, very small region, close to the Nahal En-Gev, we see the Nitzanian, the Kabarian, the Nitzanian with the small triangles, the Kabarian with the truncated bladelet, the geometric Kabarian with the geometrics, and of course the Natufian with the lunates. To add to the data we have, just recently in 2016, we went and excavated, searched for the site of En-Gev 4, which is early Epipaleolithic, Nitzanian. And luckily, we found the spot where Ofer did a small trench, and we found his original stones that maybe symbolized, maybe are a hint to some sort of an architecture feature there. And we tested around this area and found out that, not as was thought before, this En-Gev 4 has a long extension. It's more than 500 square meter around the original ditch. But I will go shortly through this just so you'll get a taste of all the Epipaleolithic entities that we have around the site in the region. Next, or maybe contemporaneous to the Nitzanian, a different culture entity, the Kabarian. And here we see hints to what will come later. We have a hut with 5 layers of occupation within, with a burial, and also this large basalt vessel that was found within the hut or on the border of the hut. Next to it, very close by, is En-Gev 3, which also has probably several layers of a hut within. It was a smaller area was excavated, but had all the things that typify such a culture entity as we know in other places, the geometric Kabarian. Now, I just want to jump, and I'm still in the small area of the Sea of Galilee. I want to jump to the other side just to mention the very famous site Ohalo 2, which just recently in 2019, Stier et al. Published an article that even suggests that first evidence of agriculture or domestication occurred already at these early dates, and this sits on the southern part of the Sea of Galilee, western part of the Sea of Galilee. And now, a little bit to the north, we have Chof Shachaf, which was excavated with Ofer Marder and colleagues, and a very small excavation, and an ephemeral site was found there and was dated to the early Natufian. So we're going up the sequence, and in this layer, in fact, 2 layers of occupation were identified. One is the large structure 106, which is around 5 meters in diameter, only partially excavated, was found because it was cut by the tunnel, by the water tunnel. And above it, an installation, a stone installation. And next to it, as you could see here by the mouse, there is a burial, upside down burial, typical maybe of a early Natufian. So what we have here, in fact, is an early Natufian, ephemeral early Natufian occupation, which is in fact unique because it has both what we find in a base camp, maybe, but also very not dense in artifact in artifacts. And now, what is very clear in Chof Shachar, that lunates that are the fossil directeur of the Natufian are very small, but which usually are said to be to represent later parts of the Natufian, maybe even final Natufian. But it is Chilwan retouched, which is more connected to the early Natufian. By comparison that we've done with other sites, we showed that what is very strong for chronological subdivisions of the Natufian is, in fact, the retouch, more the gradual decrease in size of the lunate. And the example here of Chof Shachar is very important because, as you see here on the left, it has the Chilwan retouch, but is very, very small. Now, if we talk about lunates, now we can jump to the separation between the early and Natufian. It's not only by the size and retouch of the lunate. It was found in many studies that there are other things that differentiate between the early and the late, like the large structures, the decorated burials, and the rich in art and ornaments in the early Natufian, while in the late Natufian and final, in some sites we have small structures. Now the burials are not decorated as in the early, but have other unique elements inside the burials, but it's not the time to go into details here, but we do see skull removal and maybe increase in secondary burials. So the late Natufian and some sites change mainly in the Mediterranean zone. And if we look again at the chronology, I just want to stress here that dating these phases, the differences between the early and the late show that they're not so different in time length. The early is 1,400 years, while the late is 1,800 years. Stable culture entities for a long time, not something, an in-between culture leading into the Ppna and is established for a long time. And now, after this introductory to the scheme, to the space, and to the local area where we have the early middle Epipaleolithic and the early Natufian in a very small ephemeral site, now we wish to go to the late Natufian, to Nahal Negev. The site was dated to the range between 12,500 to 12,000, and it sits on a terrace above the Nahal Negev Wadi, about 2 kilometers away from the shore of the Sea of Galilee, as you could see here in this nice picture. Okay, and now we zoom in and look at the site, and we see that it's on the meander of the wadi, and maybe there's some sort of a bottleneck here, and maybe when and we think that when the area was wetter, maybe this was even a water body which reached even the level just below the site, the slope of the site. And here you could see the upper part of the site, which has all around, which is hilly all around, with many of the resources that are used by the Natufian on site were collected from this area, but also from afar. And now we are even zooming into the area of excavation, and I want to point out that we excavated only a part of the site. We managed to do a survey, a resuscitivity survey, and found out that the site, the border of the site on the terrace itself is about 60 meters to the left, and what you see in the picture, and follows the curve of the wadi, and there are many signs of structures that were probably also even following this curve further. So we estimate about 90 meters by 60 meters, the size of the complete size of the site. In the 10 years we've been excavating on site, we managed to unearth several walls and follow some of the structures which are both on the slope and also at the top of the terrace. The depth in the part of by the resistivity survey, the depth probably it could reach even 2 meters until bedrock. I could say now, after 10 years, that what we see now is not an erosion from the water, from the rising level of the water in the wadi, but the erosion of the settlement itself. And it seems, and you will see soon by the structures that I will get closer to, it seems that the Natufian themselves had the slope and built with the slope, both on the slope and on the terrace. I wanted to start with the elements that connect us with the Natufian, because we're talking about the boundary Natufian and Ppna. So first, it is very clear that we're talking about a Natufian site. The lithics is very homogeneous all across the site. It is very, very dense. We have a lot of lithics, and Anna can account for that. She's analyzing the lithic assemblage from the site. And indeed, it's very homogeneous, and it shows very small back lunates, meaning again that in the chronological scheme, we are at the end of the Natufian. But what is important, that we have no Ppna fossil director. We have nothing that we can compare to what usually we find lithic-wise in Ppna sites as arrowheads, Betamir, and so forth. And also, if we zoom in to the structures themselves, and first I will zoom to this part of the excavation that is marked here in red, we see that many affinities that connect, we will feel at home, we will feel Natufian in this area. I want to point out just that you see here the foxhole. This is the test excavation that Ofer Bar Yosef excavated in 73, a small test that gave him the taste for how interesting the site here, the Nahal Negev, and how many layers can be found, occupation layers within the site. Building 3 has the one that Ofer sat before on, has 2 parallel walls, which is very typical on the site. And one of the walls, the inner wall, in fact, is a sort of a bench. We cannot detect the exact location of the floor. It's not a mud plaster floor, it's a dense floor, but it had probably several layers. But please note the wall here that curves to the other side and is very close to structure 3. We will get close to it in the next slide. And the section below where you see building 4, building 3, and feature 6. Along the lecture, we will go back to feature 6, but please see here in the section building 3 on the slope with the bench and touching the area of building 4. What I want to point out, and of course I'm skipping a lot of information, but I just picked some of the elements that are important for us to feel the Natufian way of life here in this structure. We see that under the wall, there is a burial here marked in yellow. The burial is flexed, probably the pit is very clear to detect and probably was bought in even a bag. The legs were folded up to the waist, to the ribs area. And if we look at the publication of Einan from Vala 2007, and also Fanny, when she visited the site, looked at it, she said, this is very typical final Natufian burial position. It has many representations like this at Einan. And now let's zoom out again and look at building, here we were in building 3, and look up on building 4. And these are the walls that are connected between the buildings, maybe suggesting that these two are contemporaneous. And building 4 has a very special shape. It's curved on one side and straight on the other, and also have some sort of a small chamber here on the left. But I want to point out this stone over here with the stones next to it, which was probably an inner half next to, again, parallel walls of the structure. And if we look from the side, we see this antechamber again with a huge slab at its center. So we have a unique feature within this structure. We cannot really interpret it, but we see that special activities were probably held within this feature. And here is another picture of the area of the hearth on the right and the small chamber that we see here with the slab within. And now, and in between, when I want to jump to Neolithic attributes or affinities, I want to look at building 6. And in building 6, we have again these parallel walls, and you could see 2 of them here. Some are not only the style of construction and maybe also the resizing second occupation within the structure, but what's interesting that between these parallel walls, we have a cache where the yellow arrow is pointing. And within this cache, we see only small pebbles, limestone pebbles, all together between these walls. And this cache is unique. We see elements like this in the Natufian, but it became very popular also within the Neolithic. And now, when we look at a different structure, behaves completely different. We see building 7 that has, again, the outer wall, the inner wall, and an outer wall parallel wall as the style at this side. But we see that we have a floor which is plastered. You cannot see it here because of the color, but you have to believe me here. It was tested by David Frizan and the geomorphologist of the project. And this floor is a lime plaster floor. Part of it is lime plaster. And within, we saw this beautiful figurine, which resembles later things that we see in art history of the Neolithic. But also I want to point out to the inner separation here that we see, which is very uncommon in the Natufian and maybe is common in the Neolithic. And here you see that while excavating our last season in 2019, we managed to show that we have the early phase, which is only the parallel walls, this large section of parallel walls you could see well in the section drawn here on the right, with a very deep wall, more than 1 meter high, with stones like all the other structures in the site from basalt and limestone. But here, maybe not like in building 3 and 4, the stones are more dressed, are more planned well, and maybe there's even a gap here that we'll see later on in a different building. And in the recent phase, the latter phase, we have a subdivision of this structure. Maybe only similar to a later site that was excavated and published in first in 2008, where you have this inner separation division, a Chiamen site, a Ppna site. And now I want to go to another area of the site, which is a burial ground, a public space, which usually we connect to more affinities of the Ppna, something that is places that we can describe as public spaces. And here, when we just started the excavation, we noticed this wall, again from basalt and limestone, and we excavated a trench next to it just to see the stratigraphy. But closely after digging in this trench, we figured out that we are going into one sort of a burial ground with many human bones. And in fact, while going through this burial area, I would like to show also the area itself, but features next to it afterwards. So we excavated down this section, and we found that below this wonderful wall, there is a grave, an articulated woman, Homo 4, which is all covered with lime plaster, very thick lime plaster. And that caught our attention, and we started following the lime plaster across the area to the east and to the west of this wall. And indeed, we found large quantities of plaster, and you could see its thickness marked here with the yellow arrow, and also divisions, again, divisions of the area with stones covered, large, huge stones probably, covered with thick lime plaster. We reached the floor of the lime plaster, and we noticed that inside this lime plaster floor, we have many individuals buried. And here you could see on the left a skull and another burial on the right, maybe even some ochre on one of the bones on the right. But when we first analyzed the plaster, led by David Frisam and his study with the FTIR, he analyzed and made some slides and showed that the plaster is a very high quality, probably burned in very high temperature that is not even needed when you need high quality, when you need plaster. In fact, when he compared it to later plaster commonly used in the PPNB, he saw that the temperature is not as high there in the PPNB, and the quality of the plaster is not so high. It is not so clean as we see here. It's like they were testing this technology, working on this technology, getting high temperature and using this very clean lime plaster. But after reaching this floor of lime plaster and burials, we first covered the human remains and wanted to see the extent of this burial ground. Wanted to see if we could first define the public area that we see here. And we found that the lime plaster, as you could see on the right, is reaching these large stones that form a dressed again wall with gaps. Let's get closer, with gaps in between, probably 4 poles, which were holding a large roof over this important locality. Oh, sorry. And since then, we excavated the area and tried to uncover the wall, and we can now identify 2 phases of burial. One, the earliest burial, all covered with lime plaster. Later on, the Natufian returned to the burial ground, but covered differently within pits, as you could see here marked in the pink circles here. But we wanted to finish and reach the wall to see if we could, the original wall that was where we started the ditch, started the sample, connects to this wonderful wall that we found where the plaster reached to. And indeed, in our last season, before the corona, and hopefully we'll return this summer, but in the last season, we managed to connect the walls from the large stones with the plaster all the way up to the wall that you saw before. So it means that we have here a very large structure, 7 meters in diameter, reaching maybe even more than 3 meters high. And preliminary reconstruction you could see of the structure here on the right. So maybe we could even say that with this wall and future excavation within this burial ground, we will manage to say, well, we're talking here about some sort of a monumental architecture, maybe even similar to what we see again in the east, in the north. And I must say that many of the things that have Ppna affiliation touch more the north than the local, but here you see what we see later on in Jifr al-Ahmar and Tel Abri 3, again with these gaps for the lodge of wood, probably for the construction of the roofs. And as promised, the two features next to the large burial ground. And the first one is feature 100, which all to its death, it became sterile as we dug within. We found few bones also at the bottom, this rectangular feature with slabs. At its base, it has a slab, which was also covered with stones, but many fox bones within. And you could see a long bone here, and in fact, their density grows within the feature, but also a mandible and other elements of fox were found around. This maybe can hint to things that we see much later in the Neolithic as the fox from Kfar HaChoresh, or even in Göbekli Tepe, the representation of fox is very common. The next feature I want to point out is feature 101, and this resembles a pit for feasting, maybe. We found cow bones within a very distinct pit that you could see here well in the section, with several cow bones within that were buried within this pit. And maybe again it hits to some sort of pits that we know earlier, but mainly later within the Neolithic. The last feature I want to point out is feature 6, which sits below, not at the same level of building 3, sits below the building. And when excavating it, first of all, we saw its unique shape. It curves up, and it comprises of several layers of plaster. And some of them are lime plaster, again, heated to high temperatures. But what's interesting is that the inner layer, as was discussed here and as shown in this graph, the sample that come from the inner layer of the plaster were not heated, meaning it was not some sort of a pit for cooking or for high temperature, but it was very well protected and also curved at its upper part, resembling what we see later as storage pits. And maybe this is an early evidence of a storage pit at Nahal and Gib. I want to talk now about a few artifacts that again connect us to some of the elements that we see in the Ppna, or maybe in contemporary sites. We have many perforated items and also perforators. In fact, very high percentage of perforators within the sediment, within the lithic artifact, but also these lime perforated stones that were drilling. We always laugh on site. We say that they were crazy on drilling, because in every bucket there's something connected to drilling within Nahal and Geb. And here I just want to jump for a second and show you the analysis in very few words of what we're doing in our laboratory, the computational archaeology laboratory. And this project is done with Talia Yeshuv, who works on these perforated stones, which showed both experimentally, but also quantitatively, with the measuring the location of center of mass and measuring the minimum hole size and many other parameters, showing the uniqueness of these artifacts, suggesting maybe there were spindle whorls. Sorry. And also recently, we just published the crafts visualization that we see also with fishing, where the Natufian went to the Sea of Galilee and collected these large fishes, and you could see here in the graph the large cyprinids that they specific, 98% of them were light cyprinids that they hunted 2 kilometers from the site in a specific season. They knew exactly what they wanted. They were specialized. It was not the center of their diet maybe, but they had a special group with special knowledge going to the Sea of Galilee, collecting the cyprinids, but also picking from a great array of species around the site, picking the geese as the food resource within the site. So to sum up this part of the elements that we find within the site, we see craft and specialization by the plaster production, the groundstone and the bead making, the drilling, the spinning, and the selective fishing. We see here elements that will become very popular within the Ppna and mainly in the Ppnb. We see specialization and knowledge that for specific traits within the site. I won't go into the artistic tradition, and Natalie will elaborate later comparing to other assemblages, but we also have things that connect us back to the Natufian and also to later artistic tradition, Neolithic tradition. So to sum up what we have at Nahal Negev, we see that we have affinities that touch us, hold us still in the Natufian world with the lithic assemblage, with the structure constructions, and so forth. But also we have many elements and also the date that show us that we are really zooming in to the boundary. We are there at the point between the end of the Natufian and the Ppna. And now.
Okay, great. Now it's my turn. Thanks, Leore. It's my job to now take us and put us into context a little bit by zooming us out away from the site of Nahal Negev, first to the Jordan Valley, especially the area between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And then a little bit further, even beyond that, to the greater southern Levant, and to expand the time range as well into the beginning of the early Epipaleolithic until the end of the Ppnb or so. So it's important to note that much of the discussion that focuses on the Epipaleolithic to Neolithic boundary in the southern Levant has compared late Natufian sites in the Mediterranean zone, where they're known to have lighter occupation intensity in the late Natufian, with the more sedentary sites from the early Natufian and the Ppna. So our discussion of the site of Nahal Negev up to this point suggests that this might not, it doesn't hold, at least for the site of Nahal Negev, where we clearly have greater site occupation intensity. So in this area in the Jordan Valley, surveys have identified a number of Natufian and Ppna sites, especially in this excavation has taken place on some of these. There's a few of the pattern that represents the late Natufian in the Mediterranean zone may actually reflect some population movement from that area into the Jordan Valley in the late Natufian, potentially due to the location of more prime cereal habitats as well as permanent water bodies. And it's interesting to note that if we look at the Ppna settlements, that they tend to be spaced at around 20 to 25 kilometer intervals, at least the ones that we know up to this point in time. And a similar pattern seems to emerge for the late Natufian sites as well. Sites from both of these periods, the Natufian and the Ppna, tend to be concentrated in terrace locations. Next slide. So interestingly, two of these very late Natufian sites in the Jordan Valley, Huzuk Musa and Gilgal 1, share many of the characteristics that we described as making Nahal Negev unique. So both of these sites have only been tested thus far, but the study of the recovered material shows that there are similarities with Nahal Negev too, especially those features that have the greatest affinity with the Ppna. So here you can see some of the affinities in terms of the structural layout of the site of Huzuk Musa. You can see the plan here on the upper right, as well as the structures, which are, you know, the same style, semi-subterranean structures that we see at Nahal Negev, as well as some of the bedrock mortars that are inset that start to emerge in the late Natufian and become especially common in the Ppna. Next slide. So the similarities continue, especially into the lithic assemblages, where you see a high percentage of perforators in the tool assemblage. And these are really significantly higher than what we see at other sites. So at these three sites, Nahal Negev, Gilgal 2, and Huzuk Musa, they reach up to 25 to 35% of the assemblages, which is really high compared to other sites where they're only around 2 to 4%. So you can see that these are really sort of jumping out at you, as do activities that are associated with them. They clearly use these perforators on site for production, for example, of shell beads that you see on the right here, that are in varying stages of production. So you see not only finished beads, but also ones preforms and ones that are broken during manufacture. Sickle blades also have similar technology, and the similarities at these sites suggests that we're dealing with a locally intensive phenomenon where these people in these sites are interacting with one another on more intensive basis probably than some other areas. Next slide. So continuity in the Jordan Valley is also illustrated in when we directly compare these late Natufian sites with the Ppna sites that are in the same area. And similarities are especially apparent in the architecture. You can see the late Natufian plans of the sites we already talked about on the top and some of the Ppna plans on the bottom. And the structures in these examples are all semi-subterranean. They're built using stone foundations. And in the Natufian likely supported a brush superstructure, which was more likely mud brick in the Ppna, especially in the Jordan Valley and areas to the east. These structures are also in the late Natufian already more oval in plan than early Natufian houses, which are structures that tend to be more round. And this is also similar to what we see in the Ppna. Next slide. So a notable change in the architecture that has been ascribed, especially to the Ppna, not only in the southern Levant with the site of Wadi Fainan, which was talked about recently, and also the northern Levant especially, is the appearance of buildings that have been ascribed special purpose or communal kinds of functions. And although these are quite variable, the buildings like the one from Wadi Fainan again are distinguished largely based on size and also differences in their features that distinguish them from other architecture at the site. So they've been cited as evidence for significant change in the organization of these communities, which have become increasingly sedentary related to the onset of the Natufian, the Neolithic. So although special purpose structures have recently been actually identified in the late Natufian, first in our previous work in Helozone Taktit, where we identify two round structures, which are much smaller, and were used intentionally for burial practices, not just for grave, but also for the debris of the ritual practices that accompanied that ritual activity. But those are very different in scale from the ones that we see in the Ppna. But it's quite interesting, the example that we see in Nahal Negev, which shows us that this is actually present on a much different scale. And the setting of the building suggests that it's significantly more complex than other buildings. And given the number of burials, the monumentality of the architecture that we're seeing emerging, and also the location and position of the building clearly showed the emergence of a communal special purpose kinds of buildings associated with ritual activities in the late Natufian as well, that are clearly antecedent in many ways to these buildings that we see emerging in both Ppna and Ppnb communities later on, which illustrates the depth of this practice extending back into the late Natufian, at least in the Jordan Valley. Next slide, please. So getting back to some of the artistic features from the late Natufian also shows some degree of continuity with the later Ppna assemblages. And this is especially true of the very late Natufian artifacts that are found in the Jordan Valley, including Nahal Negev. So 3 of the examples that are shown here include the geometric and wavy line motifs that are engraved in stones, anthropomorphic faces and heads that are engraved in bones and stones, as well as the appearance of greenstone, which first shows up in the late Natufian. And here you see examples of double pierce beads that become much more common in the Ppna. And Denny Bar Youssef has described these as chronological markers of the late Natufian and Ppna periods. The engraved items from Nahal Negev, which have been studied by Danish Shacham, have antecedents in the early Natufian, but more strongly aligned with motifs and stylistic attributes of the Ppna, especially those from the northern Levant. So Dana has showed this by connecting elements from the art items from Nahal Negev II into a number of style sequences that show continuity from the early Natufian and into the Ppna. These include the simple linear compositions of in the engraved stone plaques that you see here on the left, as well as the soft shaping of features in the engraved face in the center of the engraved faces here, which are features that become more common in the Ppna. Next slide. So there's plenty of other evidence for continuity between the late Natufian and the Ppna in the Jordan Valley, but now we're going to take another step back and out to look a little bit more broadly at this period, and not just the continuity piece between the Ppna and the Natufian, but also to look at the Southern Levant more broadly. And it's interesting to note that when you look at some of the sites indicated here on this map, which date from the geometric Kabaran through the Ppnb period, so not every site is represented here, you'll see the key localities and many of the key sites. And what you note is in those that have more than one occupation, these are most frequently Natufian and Ppna occupations, and those are indicated in the different shades of red here on the slide. So there tends to be continuity in occupation at sites, though not in every case. But if you're going to see continuity, it's more often associated with this particular juncture. Next slide. So first, just another look at continuity in architecture again, going back to the early Natufian, first of all, in the Southern Levant more generally. And there in the early Natufian, we tend to see round subterranean substructures first becoming common, especially in the Mediterranean zone, but also in Eastern Jordan and the Jordan Valley. And this represents really a significant break from times that went before. Although we find evidence of floors, especially of huts like at Ohala 2 and Karne 4, there's also evidence like Leore showed earlier from Negev, where we have sort of some hut features. These are really on a significantly different scale than what we see in the Natufian period. Likewise, we see another shift in architecture that's more prominent when we get over to the Ppnb, which, as many of you have discussed already, we know is typified in many cases by square walled or square building contiguous rooms that are above ground and appear in many places, though not at exactly the same time. Next slide. So the faunal record in the Southern Levant shows a similar pattern in terms of where the sort of the breaks in similarities or the differences in similarities are. So beginning at the beginning of the early Epipaleolithic and the end of the Ppnb, and this data that I'm showing here comes from a study we've done with colleagues from the Mediterranean sites. The first break occurs between the middle Epipaleolithic and the Natufian, while a second break separates the Ppna from the Ppnb. And in both cases, this change is visible in 3 faunal indicators. 2 of them are shown here. One, the abundance of gazelles out of all the ungulates, which is shown on the left. And the second, the percentage of juvenile gazelles that you see within the juvenile fraction, even though these are not shown here. So at the junction between the middle Epipaleolithic and the Natufian, we see a clear increase in the abundance of gazelles. Those are indicated there in the orange box. And we see the stability between the Natufian and the Ppna assemblages, which are very similar. And we see the same when we move to the small game fraction, which in the Natufian and Ppna assemblages typically reaches up to 33% of the assemblages. And this is also continuous across this period in time. But interestingly, we see a second shift after this that also occurs around the same time after the Ppna. And this is a reversal in the trends that we see earlier in the sequence in all three of those faunal indices again. So we see them returning to more or less pre-Natufian levels. And this shift coincides, interestingly, in the ungulate fraction, when the gazelle abundances start to drop off, they're replaced instead of with cervids, which we see before the Natufian period, is the most common other game animal or ungulate animal in addition to the gazelle. We see that they are being replaced by wild goat, wild boar, and wild cattle in the periods after this time, which is a very interesting change and is what we believe is an indication of very early management of these populations that ultimately become domesticated. Next slide. So unfortunately, the plant record is confounded by preservation issues, especially during the Epipaleolithic. And in these time periods, the chard remains barely preserved at all. And this is clearly attested to by this table that was published by Asudi and Fuller in their 2012 paper on the Southern Levant, where we see only 1 or 2 Epipaleolithic assemblages. Nevertheless, the data does have a lot to say about the pre-pottery Neolithic periods, and this data is really important. Asudi and Fuller note that prior to the PPNB, none of the Southern Levantine sites have provided any incontestable evidence for domesticated type cereals. But they do note that at least one crop has some indication of domestication syndrome, which they define as large seed size or a sizable minority of non-shattering rachises. And about at least half the assemblages here, they're indicated by the small d, and the section that's indicated or highlighted here as the PPNA. On the basis of this and the discovery of enormous concentrations of wild barley and at the Ppna site of Netiv Hagdud and rambling vetch at Gilgal, as well as the identification of potential storage spaces as Ian Kite was talking about a couple of weeks ago, many have argued for what has been termed pre-domestication cultivation in the Ppna. The shift to fully domesticated status was assigned by Asudi and Fuller in this table when non-shattering rachis remains represent the majority of the assemblage, or when they were found alongside significantly enlarged grains. And this does not occur until the PPNB, as you can see by those boxes indicated by the capital D and the shading, and in this case occurs in often in multiple of the crops that are indicated here in the table. Next slide. Now, because of this preservation bias, the Natufian continues to be a black box in terms of plant use, and thus it's really difficult to pinpoint when these characters that have been described as evidence of cultivation first appear. Multiple lines of indirect evidence attest to the importance of cereals for humans in the Natufian. These include the appearance and abundance of sickle blades and the diversification of groundstone, including bedrock features that you see illustrated here on this slide. And also evidence for storage, which in the Natufian, as we've heard about already as well, there are fewer very convincing features, though the one that Leore described earlier for Nahalangev is a more convincing version. The less perishable evidence recorded thus far does suggest an increase in storage capacity in the Ppna, but the magnitude of this compared to the Natufian remains really difficult to quantify due to these problems of preservation, not only of plants, but also of storage features. So feature 6 at Nahalangev is a good example, since it was built into a natural terrace. It's distinguished from the sediment by a layer of clay, but this has deteriorated significantly over time and has left quite an ephemeral archaeological signature that's difficult to detect. Similar features could easily be overlooked in the archaeological record. And as Ian mentioned also a couple weeks ago, the basket that was recently recovered from the Judean desert reveals a very important but perishable part of the record that really can't be overlooked. In summary, the secondary evidence that's therefore supports continuous intensification and serial use from the Natufian to the Ppna, while the primary evidence from plants and secondary indicators reveal a more pronounced disjunction at the beginning of the PPMB when clear morphological evidence for full-fledged domestication first arises. And next slide. So we've shown how zooming into an important moment in time at the site of Nahal and Gev reveals continuity across the Epipaleolithic-Neolithic boundary. Although certain cultural markers clearly change at this boundary so that it's easy to distinguish a site that's from the Natufian from a site that's from the Ppna, the changes in the most important aspects, including things like community organization, social structure, and economy, are far more gradual. And in these most important senses, the boundary between the Epipaleolithic and the Neolithic in this region is not significant. This observation is reinforced by our examination of late Natufian and Ppn sites, both in the Jordan Valley and within the Southern Levant more broadly. Still, although researchers such as Anna and Nigel have noted affinities between the late Natufian and Ppna, others argue that many of the changes we've highlighted don't begin until the Ppna. So given its timing and many of the features we've noted, we believe that Nahal and Gev and these other sites in the Jordan Valley that are similar have an important role to play in this discussion. Importantly, this continuity fits into a much larger narrative of gradual long-term change that has been gathering support as an explanation for neolithization, especially in the context of plant domestication. It's been discussed by many for Southwest area more broadly. Next slide, please. And it's interesting to sort of give a little bit of historical perspective here when we talk about continuity between the Natufian and the Neolithic, since it was already observed early on in the Southern Levant by pioneering archaeologist Dorothy Garrod. I'm not sure why those yellow lines are appearing. But it's okay. I thought I was doing it at first.
No.
It's okay. Anyway, she initially was the one to define the Natufian culture, and she described it as a Mesolithic culture, somewhere between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, based on partially on microlithic technology and other things. But she argued that the Natufians practiced, interestingly, she did argue that the Natufians practiced an early form of agriculture. And decades later in the 1960s, Jacques Perrot introduced the term Epipaleolithic, which is now still commonly used today for this period, as a replacement for Mesolithic, because this was based on his work at the Natufian site of Ainan or Ain Malaha, which he intentionally chose that term Epipaleolithic, or the end of the Paleolithic, to highlight affinities with the preceding Upper Paleolithic people and their hunter-gatherer adaptation. So the widespread use of the term Epipaleolithic in this region up until today de-emphasizes the much greater continuity between the Natufian and the Ppna that followed. And through the establishment of these categories, it's influenced the research agenda in the Levant, although it is important to note that some scholars, such as Itzhak Gilead, have later criticized the terminology, pointing out that there is a distinct boundary between the early and middle phases of the Epipaleolithic, which are more closely have more close affinities with the Upper Paleolithic than the late Epipaleolithic, which he viewed as more emergence of more complex societies. So next slide, please. So zooming out to the wider Southern Levant supported then our observations about the Epipaleolithic-Neolithic boundary, but it also highlighted a number of episodes of more rapid and intensive change. In particular, this associated with the beginning of the early Natufian and the onset of the PPMB. And this may be partially related to the change in the scale of observation. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that the emergence of the Natufian is associated with a pulse of more rapid social and economic reorganization that's reflected in early Natufian communities. And we see a notable increase in the permanence of architectural features and human graves as well, diversification of human diets to include more labor-intensive plant and animal remains, and the appearance of commensal animals such as the house mouse, which indicate that site permanence plays a very important part of this story. So although early on sedentism was linked closely to agriculture, decades of research in many geographic areas have reflected a significant reduction in residential mobility before the emergence of full-fledged agricultural economies. The early Natufian is a good example of this. Nevertheless, why the significant jump in sedentism occurs at this boundary requires further investigation. Maybe Gerard was right, and small-scale cultivation was already introduced in this point in time. It's difficult to say with a record the way it is, and here it's vital to stress that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Next slide. So another rapid pulse of change is evident when we move to the other end of the time scale and the onset of the PPMB, a period that has been well illustrated already in this series by a number of very interesting talks up until now. Anna and Nigel also established marked changes between the Ppna and PPMB in their review of the burial practices a few weeks ago. Changes are particularly evident in the built environment, notably the emergence of these contiguous square-roomed architecture, as well as economic reliance on more fully domesticated plants and animals. And in fact, much of the restructuring of Neolithic communities in the PPMB was likely intended to accommodate the new realities of year-round permanent occupation and growing populations, as well as the labor demands, ownership and regulation of new resources, and the social and ritual practices that were needed to smooth relations, given all these things among these communities. Next slide. Again, it's interesting to draw a little bit on history when considering discontinuity with the onset of the PPMB. And here we see Kathleen Kenyon, the pioneer who first excavated the Neolithic in the Southern Levant in her work at Jericho. And in the stratigraphy she drew here, which is adapted from her stratigraphy, and in her writings, she really notes this very clear stratigraphic break between the phases that she assigned to like a plaster floor and a hug brick phase, which are now known as the Ppna and the PPMB. And the stratigraphy that she drew, which you see here on the right, clearly shows this break, as well as the abandonment of the famous tower before the end of the Ppna. And then last slide. So in conclusion, the perspective that we offer allows us to consider the fit between our observation and current models for the rise of Neolithic communities. But we also want to highlight the importance of examining the Epipaleolithic to pre-pottery Neolithic timeframe at different temporal and spatial scales. So in our example, continuity is reflected across the Epipaleolithic to Neolithic boundary at all scales of our analysis. But it's especially clear at our finest scale of investigation at the site of Nahalingib 2, which occupies a short but important window of time. And currently, the primary models that explain the nature of this transition are presented as temporarily and spatially dichotomous, pitting short against long periods of change in single versus multi-regional perspectives. And we believe that the question, and as do others, believe that the question is best addressed from a variety of temporal and spatial scales. And there's room in the story for periods, of course, of more rapid and intensive change and more gradual change. And we feel that we see some of both of these things in our story. Different scales of time and space often reveal, therefore, different but complementary phenomenon of observation. And together, we believe that these provide a deeper understanding of the overall story that we've shown here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leore. Thank you, Natalie. It was great talk. So we still learn borders, both chronological and regional. So when the Epipaleolithic and when the Neolithic starts, I mean, we always update with new discoveries and new sites. I think here we are here. There are many specialists who work on this slow transition here, we can skip to question and answer part, I think. Yes, Mirban.
Leore and Natalie, thank you so much. This was great. We were updated. And Eingeb is such a great site. I mean, it's really so nice. I'm just curious about one thing. If it's not, it's just a curiosity, let me say. Are there some scholars working on a new terminology, let's say, in Levant, and skipping all Ppna, BCs, etc., but focusing more on social aspects or on such a small scale or diversities on small scale developments, etc. I mean, is there such an attempt to have a change in our traditional terminologies, classifications, etc.?
Well, of course there are. We didn't go into all these details, how to break down the Ppna, and I think Anna and Nigel discussed the separation of the Khiyama and Sultanian. There was always a need to separate it maybe into entities, and maybe we were not brave enough to say that we could also separate the sites that we see at the really end of the Natufian, also with its own separate name of entity, because I think we should, as we're doing now at Engeb, we should even enlarge our survey and work with other sites to further establish this. But I think it is a goal not of us, but also of many, to define these cultural entities. And in fact, when the area was just surveyed, there was, I forgot his name, maybe Anna could help me here, called these sites the Lissanian, right? He gave a name to this a specific point in time.
Williams.
Well, yes.
Williams.
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, any question? Any comment? Trevor?
Yeah, I think trying to change the names of periods is pretty well impossible, because the Natufian is within the Epipaleolithic, which is in the Pleistocene, and the Ppna is in the Holocene. You've got a geological terminology boundary there, as well as a major archaeological one. Yeah. The question I really was interested in was, I think it was Natalie showed the slide where there were settlements of Natufian and Ppna, and it showed where there was continuity from Natufian to Ppna. And I'd like to ask a little bit more about that, because I don't know much about those sites. What do you see at those sites in the Jordan Valley where you showed continuity from Ppna back in, or from late Natufian into Ppna? Because one of the things we've suffered from for a long time, mainly because we believed in the Younger Dryas, was that there's a big break in settlement pattern in the late Natufian, and then things start again completely new in Ppna. But you were showing, you didn't mention the Younger Dryas at all, yeah, which is great. But also, I'd like to know a bit more about this continuity of settlement between late Natufian and Ppna in the Jordan Valley.
You want me to?
Go ahead, Leore.
First of all, I'm glad someone said the Younger Dryas because we didn't want to. You see, first of all, by chronology, we see that the turn to the late Natufian was a little bit before the Younger Dryas, as is commonly thought. And another thing, a local analysis of the environmental changes through the late Natufian shows that it was not as harsh as was thought to be in the past. It was wetter, maybe even rainier. And it was on proxy from Ionin Cave and Chilazon Tachtit Cave, which was done by Gidon Hartman, showed that it's not, this is one example, but there are other ways today to show that the Younger Dryas was not such a big event in our area. So that's concerning the Younger Dryas. And as for the site, we have sites maybe not within the Jordan Valley, because many of the sites, the sites of Fatzael and in the area of Netiv Gdud and Salapia were tested, but in this area we have both the late Natufian and the Ppna, but there are sites like Khatula, which you have there both entities, or on the other side, Arakadub or Shubeka, where you have only late Natufian and Ppna. So you see there the stratigraphy, and the early Natufian is not represented there, and not even later, the Ppnb. You have only this phase. Natalie, you probably want to add something?
I wanted to add that, yeah, onto your comment about the Younger Dryas, which if you look at the Jordan Valley, it also seems like this part is even less affected by those changes than even the Mediterranean zone, where, you know, you also have more reliable and permanent water bodies. And it seems like populations size in that area may be starting to increase already in the late Natufian. It might be related to the Younger Dryas, it might not, but it does seem to be an area that that is withstanding the impacts quite easily.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments? I think Tobias is not here tonight. Bill, do you want to say something about?
I am here.
Oh, Tobias here.
I
Hi,
saw
Tobias.
Tobias before.
Sorry, I had my camera turned off.
Hi.
Hi.
So,
Sorry, I've been in conference
do you
all
want
day.
to say
My brain is pretty empty.
question?
It's fine.
Okay. Bill?
Yes, no, on those points of continuity and discontinuity and so on, I mean, I think you know, we still lack quite a lot of evidence, but there's no doubt, for example, the site of WF16, where we have some early dates that go back into the Pleistocene, into the Younger Dryas. And you have to remember that we only excavated part way down through the sequence of that site. We know there's an earlier phase, so we know that it goes on below. We have in our lower layers, we do have a gradual change in the lithics, and we have more lunates. Unfortunately, they're lunates with Hell-1 retouch, but I think that's part of the great diversity of everything we find everywhere, isn't it? I mean, it's part of our problem is that none of these chronological periods work very well in a nice, neat slices of time thing. There's actually much more local diversity going on all the time, which disrupts that completely, which is another reason I think it's pointless in a sense trying to find new terms for these things. We're not going to rename the Ppna because, you know, the Ppna is just a time slice through a whole range of local Neolithic things that are happening, or pre-Neolithic. I mean, that's the other problem as well, isn't it? I mean, this business about when does agriculture start, when does cultivation start? You know, these are all terms that we're constantly redefining to try and fit the evidence of this transitional period, and we're not yet there, I don't think. So clearly there's a lot of transition. And I once spent a very lovely day or half a day visiting Leore on site, and it's a lovely site. But the moment I got there, I was struck with how many of the features on the site, to me, looked perfectly at home on a Ppna site. I've never dug on a Natufian site, so I couldn't say the other way around, unless of course WF16 is a half Natufian site. But very visibly when you're there, you know, a lot of it looks Ppna. And you know, if we're down to looking for a few fossil director finds like alkyne points, you know, we've got plenty of Ppna sites that have no alkyne points. You know, and one of the things that, I mean, Nigel has told me off in the past about some of my comments about the Harifian and the Ppna in the south, which I think, you know, there again is clear overlap. And again, our chronological control is not that good. We're all having in some of these periods to date wood charcoal. We suspect there's old wood effects, but we're never quite sure how big those are. And all sorts of boundary problems occur at this point in time. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a continuity in some traits, but not necessarily in others. But also that there's a local diversity. You're Lissanian, you know, great. I mean, although I'm at the point where I'm very cautious about labeling anything with these cultural historic terms, because you're bound to find something else that changes your mind quite quickly in a way. But I think, yeah, I mean, in a sense, don't stress about the Natufian and the Ppna, because it's all about what's happening locally, and everybody's doing their own thing within this array of transformation and shift.
Thank you. Okay, Çiler. Çiler mikrofonu kapalı sanırım.
Maybe she raised her hand by mistake.
No. Okay, any other question?
Maybe I'll just say something to Bill. So thank you for this comment, and I'm happy you agree and you're excavating close by. But one thing is interesting, that we see all this confusing trend within the Natufian and the Ppna, but we do see some sort of jumps or considerable change before the Natufian and after the Ppna. And I think that here we focused on the continuity, Natufian, Ppna, but on the borders we do see some sort of a discontinuity. So there are blocks, there are jumps, but in between.
Can I make a little comment on this?
Yes.
Just to add a little bit to the confusion. And and this time it's really not my own thought, and it's I do really have an urge to cite Offer, who told me something about this. I doubt that he ever wrote it, but he said over the last few years, he thought it was a mistake to adopt Epipaleolithic. We should have stayed with late Paleolithic. Mm-hmm. So throw the Natufian back into the Paleolithic and start with the Neolithic right there. You know, of course there was a transition. I don't think that anyone ever thought differently. There is some kind of a process going on from one to the other. But if you want to define it, he thought that Epipaleolithic was simply too confusing and didn't contribute very much to understanding any changes. So there. But then I asked myself, so why didn't you ever write it if you were so sure of that? Well, maybe he wasn't that sure of it. I don't know, but that's it.
Thank you. I think Çiler döndü mü Çiler? So Nigel, are you around?
Yeah. Hi. Whoops. Sorry.
Hi.
Okay.
Any question and comment?
That's fine. Everyone is tired.
Can I ask or make a comment?
Yes, please, Sajid.
Okay, just considering the last conversation or talk, I think that, yeah, looks so, at least if you look at the whole Southwest Asia, including, I'm gonna talk a little bit more specifically in terms of the Zagros, or eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, that, yeah, looks so that Epipaleolithic can be defined as a late Paleolithic. Oh, and another thing that I just wanted to say that I'm wondering for how long, as I actually asked Anna one of in her presentation, we're gonna stick to those terminology, and as you actually all we know that Ppna was not Neolithic, as we know. And if we want to change the terminology and leave the, for example, Natufian and so on, and how about the Ppna? Ppna looks like to have been true transitional Neolithic. Nothing more, nothing less. If we look at the, but depends on how we can, we're gonna define the true Neolithic in archaeology in terms of what subsistence strategy. Yeah, if so, PPNB would be the true Neolithic. Otherwise, the PPNA can be defined as the transitional Neolithic. So I think that transitional Neolithic can be an alternative terminology for PPNA. Thank you.
Yes.
Can I come back in again, Gunesh?
Yes, please, Trevor.
I don't know, is Marion with us this evening? Marion Bentz? Because there's one other area where there is absolutely clear continuity from Epipaleolithic into the Holocene, yeah? And that's in the Tigris Valley, sites like Kirtik Tepe and Gusir Tepe, yeah? Where there are dates which are beyond 10,000 BC, yeah? And there is, the only way you can tell where the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, or between the Epipaleolithic and the Neolithic, is by looking at the radiocarbon dates. There's absolute continuity of settlement, architecture, material culture, economy, everything, yeah? Over that huge boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. But I don't think we can ever get rid of it. One of the things that we're stuck with is the labels which are on things. If we try and write a new prehistory with a completely new set of labels, yeah, nobody will use it to teach from. It just won't get, won't get through to students. It'll just be a book which just gets forgotten on the library shelves. I'm not saying it's great to have the old, that we ought to keep the labels. I just think it's impossible to get rid of them. Yeah, we just have to live with them. Yeah, and learn to describe what's happening more clearly. And I'm absolutely entirely with tonight's talk from Leore and Natalie that the last part of the Epipaleolithic and the first part of the Holocene are the same chapter. They're two halves of the same chapter. if you're thinking in terms of a book. You should have an early Epipaleolithic chapter, and then a late Epipaleolithic Ppna chapter, and then get on to the less interesting stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're not suggesting a new terminology, just trying to emphasize these interesting continuities because they do go across this boundary that is quite fixed and has an interesting history. So it's important to also to talk about that because we start to see more and more as we excavate more and more in the late Natufian, we start to see more and more features that indicate that a lot of things are getting going much earlier than we might have thought initially.
Okay, Mirvan.
I am talking in name of Çiler Çilingiroğlu because I think she cannot get the connection, and she says in the chat that my Wi-Fi kicked me out. I wanted to come back to Mihriban Hoca's point and suggest with better absolute chronologies, one can in fact start refer to millenniums and not terms like early Natuf, late Natuf, Ppna, to avoid the notion that there is a major break in the lifestyle. And it will make comparison much easier with other regions, she says. I simply do not propose to change the terminology. You should not misunderstand, or not to change the names, but I think it's time to think on more fine-tuning transitions or local differences, etc., etc. I guess in Turkey, we suffer a lot because of such chronological frames, of such block terminologies, etc., etc. That's what I mean. I mean, I'm not suggesting let's forget about Ppna or B. That's not my point. But I think we can start talking about such, as I said, transitions or different scales of development, etc. So I just wanted to read Çiler Çilingiroğlu's question. She cannot get the connection now, but she may listen to it afterwards when she can connect to the YouTube. So this is what I said.
Thank you.
Any comments, question? Anna.
Yeah, I would like to respond. It is really a very thorny issue. I mean, all this nomenclature, but and sometimes I was really, I'm getting confused like everyone around using them, but I do agree with Trevor that it will be very difficult to change things and it will be even more confusing. And I would also say something about the danger of replacing the particular names. And I suppose that you didn't mean it, Mirvan, that will abolish the use of the Natufian or the Kebaran, because I think that's a great achievement that we finally can, even though it's so, remote in time, identify particularities of a group. And even though it's very confusing with all those names, I'm sure that a lot of you got really confused by hearing all this Mazrakan and Kebaran geometric and Itzanan. And I mean, it's really very confusing. But I think it's actually an achievement when you can, go back in time 10,000 years or 15,000 years and actually identify something which is located in a certain region at a certain point of time and has its own particularities. Maybe you can share some of those particularities with other groups, but they are still different enough to be considered as something discrete. And what frightens me is when we move, or if we, God forbid, move to just using, people of the 10th century or the 10th millennia and people of the 9th millennia and people of the 8th millennia, we lose all the particularities that we managed to gain through all those years of prehistoric research. And that's why we are stuck in this limbo. And I wouldn't change the nomenclature. I would just ask people to be very careful how they use it and explain what they mean or what they refer to.
I absolutely agree with Anna. I think that's the important thing. And what I think I was trying to say is that we shouldn't see these things as nice, neat time slices that you just put things into. They're very particular things. And we can use those names in a very particular way and actually probably continue to hopefully subdivide areas and regions within this where we can see people doing particular, culturally distinct activities. And I don't think we'll have a nice, neat, old-fashioned cultural history, and Toby doesn't have to throw things at me about that. But I think we'll be able to recognize interaction patterns and so on and what's happening by doing this. And I think it will help us understand what's happening much more. But I wouldn't go for the sort of chronological time slice approach, because I think you lose all of that. Yeah. And you can use, obviously we need to use the chronology and understand the chronology, and the chronology is vitally important. But what it shows us is how these different units in the past interact and interrelate. But it's a very messy picture. And I think that's one of the things that as we get more information, we see just how rich and messy it is. It's not a nice, neat bits of, chronological slices or anything. It's real people doing things, and they're doing things differently. And ideas get picked up in some places. Other areas, they get forgotten and then reappear later on. So it's a very rich picture. And what's surprising is how we're still almost, and people keep on saying this, we're at the beginning, we're still, it's opening up in front of us. And there's a lot of work still to be done.
Yeah. I think Glenn Isaac said something which I always cite, and excuse all those, I'm asking the forgiveness of all the people that heard me saying it time and again. And he was referring to much earlier period, but he said, you people are squeezing blood from stones, and that's what we are doing. So prehistory is not easy to perform, the study of prehistory. And all this terminology is part of the burden we carry around doing prehistory.